For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Studies in Pessimism by Arthur Schopenhauer. Chapter 1. On the Sufferings of the World. Unless suffering is the direct and immediate object of life, our existence must entirely fail of its aim. It is absurd to look upon the enormous amount of pain that abounds everywhere in the world, and originates in needs and necessities inseparable from life itself, as serving no purpose at all, and the result of mere chance. Each separate misfortune as it comes seems, no doubt, to be something exceptional, but misfortune in general is the rule. I know of no greater absurdity than that propounded by most systems of philosophy in declaring evil to be negative in its character. Evil is just what is positive. It makes its own existence felt. Leibniz is particularly concerned to defend this absurdity, and he seeks to strengthen his position by using a palpable and paltry sophism. Translator's note. Confer Theod, section 153. Leibniz argued that evil is a negative quality, i.e., the absence of good, and that its active and seemingly positive character is an incidental and not an essential part of its nature. Cold, he said, is only the absence of the power of heat, and the active power of expansion in freezing water is incidental and not an essential part of the nature of cold. The fact is that the power of expansion in freezing water is really an increase of repulsion amongst its molecules, and Schopenhauer is quite right in calling the whole argument a sophism. End translator's note. It is the good which is negative. In other words, happiness and satisfaction always imply some desire fulfilled, some state of pain brought to an end. This explains the fact that we generally find pleasure to be not nearly so pleasant as we expected, and pain very much more painful. The pleasure in this world, it has been said, outweighs the pain, or at any rate, there is an even balance between the two. If the reader wishes to see shortly whether this statement is true, let him compare the respective feelings of two animals, one of which is engaged in eating the other. The best consolation in misfortune or misfortune of any kind will be the thought of other people who are in a still worse plight than yourself. And this is a form of consolation open to everyone. But what an awful fate this means for mankind as a whole. We are like lambs in a field, disporting themselves under the eye of the butcher, who chooses out first one and then another for his prey. So it is that in our good days we are all unconscious of the evil fate may have presently in store for us: sickness, poverty, mutilation, loss of sight, or reason. No little part of the torment of existence lies in this, that time is continually pressing upon us, never letting us take breath, but always coming after us like a taskmaster with a whip. If at any moment time stays his hand, it is only when we are delivered over to the misery of boredom. But misfortune has its uses, for as our bodily frame would burst asunder if the pressure of the atmosphere was removed, so, if the lives of men were relieved of all need, hardship, and adversity, if everything they took in hand were successful, they would be so swollen with arrogance that, though they might not burst, they would present the spectacle of unbridled folly, nay, they would go mad. And I may say, further, that a certain amount of care or pain or trouble is necessary for every man at all times. A ship without ballast is unstable and will not go straight. Certain it is that work, worry, labor, and trouble form the lot of almost all men their whole life long. But if all wishes were fulfilled as soon as they arose, how would men occupy their lives? What would they do with their time? If the world were a paradise of luxury and ease, a land flowing with milk and honey, where every jack obtained his Jill at once and without any difficulty, men would either die of boredom or hang themselves. Or there would be wars, massacres, and murders, so that, in the end, mankind would inflict more suffering on itself than it has now to accept at the hands of nature. In early youth, as we contemplate our coming life, we are like children in the theater before the curtain is raised, sitting there in high spirits and eagerly waiting for the play to begin. It is a blessing that we do not know what is really going to happen. Could we foresee it? There are times when children might seem like innocent prisoners, condemned not to death, but to life, and as yet all unconscious of what their sentence means. Nevertheless, every man desires to reach old age, in other words, a state of life of which it may be said, "It is bad today, and it will be worse tomorrow, and so on till the worst of all." If you try to imagine as nearly as you can what an amount of misery, pain, and suffering of every kind the sun shines upon in its course, you will admit that it would be much better if, on the earth as little as on the moon, the sun were able to call forth the phenomena of life, and if, here as there, the surface were still in a crystalline state. Again, you may look upon life as an unprofitable episode disturbing the blessed calm of non-existence, and, in any case, even though things have gone with you tolerably well, the longer you live, the more clearly you will feel that, on the whole, life is a disappointment, nay, a cheat. If two men who were friends in their youth meet again when they are old, after being separated for a lifetime, the chief feeling they will have at the sight of each other will be one of complete disappointment at life as a whole, because their thoughts will be carried back to that earlier time when life seemed so fair as it lay spread out before them in the rosy light of dawn, promised so much, and then performed so little. This feeling will so completely predominate over every other that they will not even consider it necessary to give it words, but on either side it will be silently assumed and form the groundwork of all they have to talk about. He who lives to see 2 or 3 generations is like a man who sits some time in the conjurer's booth at a fair and witnesses the performance twice or thrice in succession. The tricks were meant to be seen only once, and when they are no longer a novelty and cease to deceive, their effect is gone. While no man is much to be envied for his lot, there are countless numbers whose fate is to be deplored. Life is a task to be done. It is a fine thing to say, defunctus est. It means that the man has done his task. If children were brought into the world by an act of pure reason alone, would the human race continue to exist? Would not a man rather have so much sympathy with the coming generation as to spare it the burden of existence?
Right.
Or at any rate, not take it upon himself to impose that burden upon it in cold blood? I shall be told, I suppose, that my philosophy is comfortless, because I speak the truth, and people prefer to be assured that everything the Lord has made is good. Go to the priest, then, and leave philosophers in peace. At any rate, do not ask us to accommodate our doctrines to the lessons you have been taught. That is what those rascals of sham philosophers will do for you. Ask them for any doctrine you please, and you'll get it. Your university professors are bound to preach optimism, and it is an easy and agreeable task to upset their theories. I have reminded the reader that every state of welfare, every feeling of satisfaction, is negative in its character. That is to say, it consists in freedom from pain, which is the positive element of existence. It follows, therefore, that the happiness of any given life is to be measured not by its joys and pleasures, but by the extent to which it has been free from suffering, from positive evil. If this is the true standpoint, the lower animals appear to enjoy a happier destiny than man. Let us examine the matter a little more closely. However varied the forms that human happiness and misery may take, leading a man to seek the one and shun the other, the material basis of it all is bodily pleasure or bodily pain. This basis is very restricted. It is simply health, food, protection from wet and cold, the satisfaction of the sexual instinct, or else the absence of these things. Consequently, as far as real physical pleasure is concerned, the man is not much better off than the brute, except insofar as the higher possibilities of his nervous system make him more sensitive to every kind of pleasure, but also, it must be remembered, to every kind of pain.
Right.
But then, Compared with the brute, how much stronger are the passions
So
aroused
fucking
in
bored,
him?
bro.
What an immeasurable difference there is in the depth and vehemence of his emotions. And yet, in the one case, as in the other, all to produce the same result in the end, namely health, food, clothing, and so on. The chief source of all this passion is that thought for what is absent and future,
Is that a
which,
person?
with man, exercises such a powerful influence upon all he does. It is this that is the real origin of his cares, his hopes, his fears. Emotions which affect him much more deeply than could ever be the case with those present joys and sufferings to which the brute is confined. In his powers of reflection, memory, and foresight, man possesses, as it were, a machine for condensing and storing up his pleasures and his sorrows. But the brute has nothing of the kind. Whenever it is in pain, it is as though it were suffering for the first time, even though the same thing should have previously happened to it times out of number. It has no power of summing up its feelings, hence its careless and placid temper. How much it is to be envied! But in man, reflection comes in, with all the emotions to which it gives rise, and taking up the same elements of pleasure and pain which are common to him and the brute, it develops his susceptibility to happiness and misery to such a degree that, at one moment, the man is brought in an instant to a state of delight that may even prove fatal, at another to the depths of despair and suicide. If we carry our analysis a step farther, we shall find that, in order to increase his pleasures, man has intentionally added to the number and pressure of his needs, which in their original state were not much more difficult to satisfy than those of the brute. Hence, luxury in all its forms, delicate food, the use of tobacco and opium, spirituous liquors, fine clothes, and the 1,001 things that he considers necessary to his existence. And above and beyond all this, there is a separate and peculiar source of pleasure and consequently of pain, which man has established for himself, also as the result of using his powers of reflection. And this occupies him out of all proportion to its value, nay, almost more than all his other interests put together. I mean ambition, and the feeling of honor and shame. In plain words, what he thinks about the opinion other people have of him. Taking 1,000 forms, often very strange ones, this becomes the goal of almost all the efforts he makes that are not rooted in physical pleasure or pain. It is true that besides the sources of pleasure which he has in common with the brute, man has the pleasures of the mind as well. These admit of many gradations, from the most innocent trifling or the merest talk up to the highest intellectual achievements. But there is the accompanying boredom to be set against them on the side of suffering. Boredom is a form of suffering unknown to brutes, at any rate in their natural state. It is only the very cleverest of them who show faint traces of it when they are domesticated, whereas in the case of man it has become a downright scourge. The crowd of miserable wretches whose one aim in life is to fill their purses, but never to put anything into their heads, offers a singular instance of this torment of boredom. Their wealth becomes a punishment by delivering them up to misery of having nothing to do. For to escape it, they will rush about in all directions, traveling here, there, and everywhere. No sooner do they arrive in a place than they are anxious to know what amusements it affords, just as though they were beggars asking where they could receive a dole. Of a truth, need and boredom are the two poles of human life. Finally, I may mention that as regards the sexual relation, a man is committed to a peculiar arrangement which drives him obstinately to choose one person. This feeling grows now and then into a more or less passionate love, which is the source of little pleasure and much suffering. It is, however, a wonderful thing that the mere addition of thought should serve to raise such a vast and lofty structure of human happiness and misery, resting, too, on the same narrow basis of joy and sorrow as man holds in common with the brute, and exposing him to such violent emotions, to so many storms of passion, so much convulsion of feeling, that what he has suffered stands written, and may be read in the lines on his face. And yet, when all is told, he has been struggling ultimately for the same things as the brute has attained, and with an incomparably smaller expenditure of passion and pain. But all this contributes to increase the measures of suffering in human life, out of all proportion to its pleasures. And the pains of life are made much worse for man by the fact that death is something very real to him. The brute flies from death instinctively, without really knowing what it is, and therefore without ever contemplating it in the way natural to a man who has this prospect always before his eyes. So that even if only a few brutes die a natural death, and most of them live only just long enough to transmit their species, and then, if not earlier, become the prey of some other animal, whilst man, on the other hand, manages to make so-called natural death the rule, to which, however, there are a good many exceptions, the advantage is on the side of the brute, for the reasons stated above. But the fact is that man attains the natural term of years just as seldom as the brute, because the unnatural way in which he lives and the strain of work and emotion lead to a degeneration of the race, and so his goal is not often reached. The brute is much more content with mere existence than man. The plant is wholly so, and man finds satisfaction in it just in proportion as he is dull and obtuse. Accordingly, the life of the brute carries less sorrow with it, but also less of joy when compared with the life of man. And while this may be traced, on the one side, to freedom from the torment of care and anxiety, it is also due to the fact that hope, in any real sense, is unknown to the brute. It is thus deprived from any share in that which gives us the most and best of our joys and pleasures, the mental anticipation of a happy future, and the inspiriting play of fantasy, both of which we owe to our power of imagination. If the brute is free from care, it is also, in this sense, without hope. In either case, because its consciousness is limited to the present moment, to what it can actually see before it. The brute is an embodiment of present impulses, and hence what elements of fear and hope exist in its nature, and they do not go very far, arise only in relation to objects that lie before it and within reach of those impulses, whereas a man's range of vision embraces the whole of his life and extends far into the past and future. Following upon this, there is one respect in which brutes show real wisdom when compared to us. I mean their quiet, placid enjoyment of the present moment. The tranquility of mind which this seems to give them often puts us to shame for the many times we allow our thoughts and our cares to make us restless and discontented. And in fact, those pleasures of hope and anticipation which I have been mentioning are not to be had for nothing. The delight which a man has in hoping for and looking forward to some special satisfaction is a part of the real pleasure attached to it, enjoyed in advance. This is afterwards deducted, for the more we look forward to anything, the less satisfaction we find in it when it comes. But the brute's enjoyment is not anticipated, and therefore suffers no deduction, so that the actual pleasure of the moment comes to it whole and unimpaired. In the same way, too, evil presses upon the brute only with its own intrinsic weight, whereas with us, the fear of it coming often makes its burden 10 times more grievous. It is just this characteristic way in which the brute gives itself up entirely to the present moment that contributes so much to the delight that we take in our domestic pets. They are the present moment personified, and in some respects they make us feel the value of every hour that is free from trouble and annoyance, which we, with our thoughts and preoccupations, mostly disregard. But man, that selfish and heartless creature, misuses this quality of the brute to be more content than we are with mere existence, and often works it to such an extent that he allows the brute absolutely nothing more than mere bare life. The bird which was made so that it might rove over half of the world, he shuts up into the space of a cubic foot, there to die a slow death in longing and crying for freedom. For in a cage it does not sing for the pleasure of it.
Actually.
And when I see how man misuses the dog, his best friend, how he ties up this intelligent animal with a chain, I feel the deepest sympathy with the brute, and burning indignation against its master. We shall see later that by taking a very high standpoint, it is possible to justify the sufferings of mankind. But this justification cannot apply to animals, whose sufferings, while in a great measure brought about by men, are often considerable, even apart from their agency. And so we are forced to ask, why and for what purpose does all this torment and agony exist?
Alright, I'm gonna use the bathroom. Be right back.
There is nothing here to give the will pause. It is not free to deny itself, and so obtain redemption. There is only one consideration that may serve to explain the sufferings of animals. It is this: that the will to live, which underlies the whole world of phenomena, must, in their case, satisfy its cravings by feeding upon itself. This it does by forming a gradation of phenomena, every one of which exists at the expense of another. I have shown, however, that the capacity for suffering is less in animals than in man. Any further explanation that may be given of their fate will be in the nature of hypothesis, if not actually mythical in character, and I may leave the reader to speculate upon the matter for himself. Brahma is said to have produced the world by a kind of fall or mistake, and in order to atone for his folly he is bound to remain in it himself until he works out his redemption. As an account of the origin of things, that is admirable. According to the doctrines of Buddhism, the world came into being as the result of some inexplicable disturbance in the heavenly calm of nirvana, that blessed state obtained by expiation, which had endured for so long a time, the change taking place by a kind of fatality. This explanation must be understood as having at bottom some moral bearing, although it is illustrated by an exactly parallel theory in the domain of physical science, which places the origin of the sun in a primitive streak of mist, formed one knows not how. Subsequently, by a series of moral errors, the world became gradually worse and worse, true of the physical orders as well, until it assumed the dismal aspect it wears today. Excellent. The Greeks looked upon the world and the gods as the work of an inscrutable necessity, a passable explanation. We may be content with it until we can get a better. Again, Ormuzd and Ahriman are rival powers continually at war. That is not bad. But that a god like Jehovah should have created this world of misery and woe out of pure caprice, and because he enjoyed doing it, and should then have clapped his hands in praise of his own work and declared everything to be very good, that will not do.
And then shit was
In its
good.
explanation of the origin of the world, Judaism is inferior to any other form of religious doctrine professed by a civilized
I'm
nation.
awake at.
And it is quite in keeping with this, that it is the only one which presents no trace whatever of any belief in the immortality of the soul. Even though Leibniz's contention that this is the best of all possible worlds were correct, that would not justify God in having created it, for he is the creator not of the world only, but of possibility itself, and therefore he ought to have so ordered possibility as that it would admit of something better. There are two things which make it impossible to believe that this world is the successful work of an all-wise, all-good, and at the same time, all-powerful being. Firstly, the misery which abounds in it everywhere, and secondly, the obvious imperfection of its highest product, man, who is a burlesque of what he should be.
Right.
These things cannot be reconciled with any such belief. On the contrary, they are just the facts which support what I've been saying. They are our authority for viewing the world as the outcome of our own misdeeds, and therefore as something that had better not have been. Whilst, under the former hypothesis, they amount to a bitter accusation against the Creator and supply material for sarcasm, under the latter, they form an indictment against our own nature, our own will, and teach us a lesson of humility. They teach us to see that, like the children of a libertine, we come into the world with the burden of sin upon us, and that it is only through having continually to atone for this sin that our existence is so miserable, and that its end is death.
I hate how it goes on the other
There is
side.
nothing more
of it.
certain than the general truth, that it is the grievous sin of the world which has produced the grievous suffering of the world. I am not referring here to the physical connection between these two things lying in the realm of experience. My meaning is metaphysical. Accordingly, the sole thing that reconciles me to the Old Testament is the story of the fall. In my eyes, it is the only metaphysical truth in that book, even though it appears in the form of an allegory. There seems to me no better explanation of our existence than that it is the result of some false step, some sin of which we are paying the penalty. I cannot refrain from recommending the thoughtful reader a popular, but at the same time profound treatise
What
on
do you
this
cats
subject by
always?
Claudius,
Oh my god,
which
damn!
exhibits the
Leave me
essentially
alone. Actually, I
pessimistic
want to
spirit of
play the game
Christianity.
without any cats on me.
It is entitled, "Cursed is the ground for thy sake." Between the ethics of the Greeks and the ethics of the Hindus, there is a glaring contrast. In the one case, with the exception, it must be confessed, of Plato, the object of ethics is to enable a man to lead a happy life. In the other, it is to free and redeem him from life altogether, as is directly stated in the very first words of the Sankhya Karika. Allied with this is the contrast between the Greek and the Christian idea of death.
Boy.
It is strikingly
Well, you can
presented
sit
in a
beside
visible
me.
form
Do I
on a
have
fine
to
antique
be
sarcophagus
the
in
lap
the Gallery of
all day?
Florence, which exhibits in relief the whole series of ceremonies attending a wedding in ancient times, from the formal offer to the evening when Hymen's torch lights the happy couple's home. Compare that with the Christian coffin, draped in mournful black and surmounted with a crucifix. How much significance there is in these two ways of finding comfort in death. They are opposed to each other, but each is right.
Scoop you.
The one points to
Put
the
you here
affirmation
one last
of the
time.
will to
Good
live,
boy, stay here.
which remains sure of
No
life for
laptop.
all time, however rapidly its
Let me
forms may change. The other, in the symbol of suffering and death, points to the denial of the
My
will
cat
to live,
does
to
not
redemption
really
from
put the
this
mood
world,
it's
the
not
domain
on.
of death and devil. And in the question between the affirmation and the denial of the will to live, Christianity is in the last resort right. The contrast which the New Testament presents when compared to the Old, according to the ecclesiastical view of the matter, is just that existing between my ethical system and the moral philosophy of Europe. The Old Testament represents man as under the dominion of law, in which, however, there is no redemption.
What the dog
The
doing?
New Testament declares law to have failed, frees man from its dominion, and in its stead preaches the kingdom of grace, to be won by faith, love of neighbor, and entire sacrifice of self. This is the path of redemption from the evil of the world. The spirit of the New Testament is undoubtedly asceticism. However, your Protestants and rationalists may twist it to suit their purpose. Asceticism is the denial of the will to live, and the transition from the Old Testament to the New, from the dominion of law to that of faith, from justification by works to redemption through the mediator, from the domain of sin and death to eternal life in Christ, means, when taken in its real sense, the transition from the merely moral virtues to the denial of the will to live. My philosophy shows the metaphysical foundation of justice and the love of mankind, and points to the goal to which these virtues necessarily lead if they are practiced in perfection. At the same time, it is candid in confessing that a man must turn his back upon the world, and that the denial of the will to live is the way of redemption. It is therefore really at one with the spirit of the New Testament, whilst all other systems are couched in the spirit of the Old, that is to say, theoretically as well as practically, their result is Judaism, mere despotic theism. In this sense, then, my doctrine might be called the only true Christian philosophy, however paradoxical a statement this may seem to people who take superficial views, penetrating to the heart of the matter.
What are you doing over here, Andy?
If you want a safe compass to guide you through life, and to banish all doubt as to the right way of looking at it,
You
you
jerking it in
cannot
the
do
bush,
better
bro?
than accustom yourself to regard this world as a penitentiary, a sort of penal colony, or
You said penal.
ergosterion, as the earliest philosopher called it.
What am I doing?
Amongst the Christian fathers, Origen, with praiseworthy courage, took this view, which is further justified by certain objective theories of life. I refer not to my own philosophy alone, but to the wisdom of all ages, as expressed in Brahmanism and Buddhism, and in the sayings of Greek philosophers like Empedocles and Pythagoras, as also by Cicero, in his remark that the wise men of old used to teach that we come into this world to pay the penalty of crime committed in another state of existence, a doctrine which formed part of the initiation into the mysteries. And Vanini, whom his contemporaries burned, finding that an easier task than to confute him, puts the same thing in a very forcible way. Man, he says, is so full of every kind of misery that were it not repugnant to the Christian religion, I should venture to affirm that if evil spirits exist at all, they have posed into human form and are now atoning for their crimes. And true Christianity, using the word in its right sense, also regards our existence as the consequence of sin and error. If you accustom yourself to this view of life, you will regulate your expectations accordingly, and cease to look upon all its disagreeable incidents, great and small, its sufferings, its worries, its misery, as anything unusual or irregular. Nay, you will find that everything is as it should be, in a world where each of us pays the penalty of existence in his own peculiar way. Amongst the evils of a
That's
penal
kind of
colony is
funny
the
if you
society
stop
of
to
those
think
who
about it.
form And if the reader is worthy of better company, he will need no words from me to remind him of what he has to put up with at present. If he has a soul above the common, or if he is a man of genius, he will occasionally feel like some noble prisoner of state, condemned to work in the galleys with common criminals, and he will follow his example and try to isolate himself. In general, however, it should be said that this view of life will enable us to contemplate the so-called imperfections of the great majority of men, their moral and intellectual deficiencies and the resulting base type of countenance, without any surprise, to say nothing of indignation. For we shall never cease to reflect where we are,
So right.
and that the men about us are beings conceived and born in sin, and living to atone for it. That is what Christianity means in speaking of the sinful nature of man. Pardon's the word to all. Whatever folly men commit, be their shortcomings or their vices what they may, let us exercise forbearance, remembering that when these faults appear in others, it is our follies and vices that we behold.
One more.
They are the shortcomings of humanity, to which we belong, whose faults, one and all, we share. Yes, even those very faults at which we now wax so indignant, merely because they have not yet appeared in ourselves. They are faults that do not lie on the surface, but they exist down there in the depths of our nature. And should anything call them forth, they will come and show themselves, just as we now see them in others. One man, it is true, may have faults that are absent in his fellow, and it is undeniable that the sum total of bad qualities is in some cases very large, for the difference of individuality between man and man passes all measure. In fact, the conviction that the world and man is something that had better not have been is of a kind to fill us with indulgence towards one another. Nay, from this point of view, we might well consider the proper form of address to be not Monsieur, Sir, mein Herr, but my fellow sufferer, soci malorum, compagnon de misere. This may perhaps sound strange,
Hey, strugglers.
but it is in keeping with the facts. It puts others in a right light, and it reminds us of that which is after all the most necessary thing in life, the tolerance, patience, regard, and love of neighbor, of which everyone stands in need, and which, therefore, every man owes to his fellow. End Chapter 1, on the sufferings of the world. This recording is in the public domain. This is a
You're a
LibriVox
heck of a
recording.
chunker, bro.
All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Studies in Pessimism by Arthur Schopenhauer. Chapter 2, On the Vanity of Existence. This vanity finds expression in the whole way in which things exist, in the infinite nature of time and space as opposed to the finite nature of the individual in both, in the ever-passing present moment as the only mode of actual existence, in the interdependence and relativity of all things, in continual becoming without ever being, in constant wishing and never being satisfied, in the long battle which forms the history of life, where every effort is checked by difficulties and stopped until they are overcome. Time is that in which all things pass away. It is merely the form under which the will to live, the thing in itself, and therefore imperishable, has revealed to it that its efforts are in vain. It is that agent by which, at every moment, all things in our hands become as nothing, and lose any real value they possess. That which has been exists no more. It exists as little as that which has never been. But of everything that exists you may say, in the next moment, that it has been. Hence, something of great importance now past is inferior to something of little importance now present, in that the latter is a reality, and related to the former as something to nothing. A man finds himself, to his great astonishment, suddenly existing after thousands and thousands of years of non-existence. He lives for a little while, and then, again, comes an equally long period when he must exist no more. The heart rebels against this, and feels that it cannot be true. The crudest intellect cannot speculate on such a subject without having a presentiment that time is something ideal in its nature. This ideality of time and space is the key to every true system of metaphysics, because it provides for quite another order of things than is to be met with in the domain of nature. This is why Kant is so great. Of every event in our life, we can say only for one moment
This is not a
that
bad
it is,
spot. You could actually
forever
hang out
after
up here and like
that it was.
really ruin somebody's day.
Every evening we are poorer by a day. It might perhaps make us mad to see how rapidly our short span of time ebbs away.
Right.
If it were not that, in the furthest depths of our being, we are secretly conscious of our share in the inexhaustible spring of eternity, so that we might always hope to find life in it again. Consideration of the kind, touched on above, might indeed lead us to embrace the belief that the greatest wisdom is to make the enjoyment of the present the supreme object of life, because that is the only reality, all else being merely the play of thought. On the other hand, such a course might just as well be called the greatest folly, for that which in the next moment exists no more and vanishes utterly like a dream can never be worth a serious effort. The whole foundation on which our existence rests is the present, the ever-fleeting present. It lies, then, in the very nature of our existence to take the form of constant motion, and to offer no possibility of our ever attaining the rest for which we are always striving. We are like a man running downhill who cannot keep on his legs unless he runs on, and will inevitably fall if he stops. Or again, like a pole balanced on the tip of one's fingers, or a planet which would fall into its sun the moment it ceased to hurry forward on its way. Unrest is the mark of existence. In a world where all is unstable, and naught can endure, but is swept onward at once in the hurrying whirlpool of change, where a man, if he is to keep erect at all, must always be advancing and moving like an acrobat on a rope. In such a world, happiness is inconceivable. How can it dwell where, as Plato says, continual becoming and never being is the sole form of existence? In the first place, a man never is happy, but spends his whole life in striving after something which he thinks will make him so. He seldom attains his goal, and when he does, it is only to be disappointed. He is mostly shipwrecked in the end, and comes into harbor with masts and rigging gone. And then, it is all one whether he has been happy or miserable, for his life was never anything more than a present moment always vanishing, and now it is over. At the same time, it is a wonderful thing that, in the world of human beings as in that of animals in general, this manifold restless motion is produced and kept up by the agency of two simple impulses, hunger and the sexual instinct, aided a little, perhaps, by the influence of boredom, but by nothing else. And that, in the theater of life, these suffice to form the primum mobile of how complicated a machinery, setting in motion how strange and varied a scene. On looking a little closer, we find that inorganic matter presents a constant conflict between chemical forces, which eventually works dissolution. And on the other hand, that organic life is impossible without constant change of matter, and cannot exist if it does not receive perpetual help from without. This is the realm of finality, and its opposite would be an infinite existence, exposed to no attack from without and needing nothing to support it. The realm of eternal peace, some timeless, changeless state one and undiversified, the negative knowledge of which forms the dominant note of the Platonic philosophy. It is to some such state as this that the denial of the will to live opens up the way. The scenes of our life are like pictures done in rough mosaic. Looked at close, they produce no effect. There is nothing beautiful to be found in them, unless you stand some distance off. So, to gain anything we have longed for is only to discover how vain and empty it is. And even though we are always living in expectation of better things, at the same time we often repent and long to have the past back again. We look upon the present as something to be put up with while it lasts, and serving only as the way towards our goal. Hence, most people, if they glance back when they come to the end of life, will find that all along they have been living ad interim. They will be surprised to find that the very thing they disregarded and let slip by unenjoyed
fuck you
is
doing?
just the life in the expectation of which they passed all their time. Of how many a man may it not be said that hope made a fool of him until he danced into the arms of death?
Right.
Then again, how insatiable a creature is man! Every satisfaction he attains lays the seeds of some new desire, so that there is no end to the wishes of each individual will. And why is this? The real reason is simply that, taken in itself, will is the lord of all worlds. Everything belongs to it, and therefore no one single thing can ever give it satisfaction, but only the whole, which is endless. For all that, it must rouse our sympathy to think how very little the will, this lord of the world, really gets when it takes the form of an individual, usually only just enough to keep the body together. This is why man is so very miserable. Life presents itself chiefly as a task. The task, I mean, of subsisting at all. Gagner sa vie. If this is accomplished, life is a burden, and then there comes the second task of doing something with that which has been won, of warding off boredom, which, like a bird of prey, hovers over us, ready to fall whenever it sees a life secure from need. The first task is to win something, the second, to banish the feeling that it has been won. Otherwise, it is a burden. Human life must be some kind of mistake. The truth of this will be sufficiently obvious if we only remember that man is a compound of needs and necessities hard to satisfy, and that even when they are satisfied, all he obtains is a state of painlessness, where nothing remains to him but abandonment to boredom. This is direct proof that existence has no real value in itself. For what is boredom but the feeling of the emptiness of life? If life, the craving for which is the very essence of our being, were possessed of any positive intrinsic value, there would be no such thing as boredom at all. Mere existence would satisfy us in itself, and we should want for nothing. But, as it is, we take no delight in existence except when we are struggling for something. And then, distance and difficulties to be overcome make our goal look as though it would satisfy us, an illusion which vanishes when we reach it, or else when we are occupied with some purely intellectual interest, when in reality we have stepped forth from life to look upon it from the outside, much after the manner of spectators at a play. And even sensual pleasure itself means nothing but a struggle and aspiration, ceasing the moment its aim is attained. Whenever we are not occupied in one of these ways, but cast upon existence itself, its vain and worthless nature is brought home to us, and this is what we mean by boredom. The hankering after what is strange and uncommon, an innate and ineradicable tendency of human nature, shows how glad we are at any interruption of that natural course of affairs which is so very tedious. That this most perfect manifestation of the will to live, the human organism, with the cunning and complex working of its machinery, must fall to dust and yield up itself and all its strivings to extinction. This is the naive way in which nature, who is always so true and sincere in what she says, proclaims the whole struggle of this will as, in its very essence, barren and unprofitable. Were it of any value in itself, anything unconditioned and absolute, it could not thus end in mere nothing. If we turn from contemplating the world as a whole, and in particular the generations of men as they live their little hour of mock existence, and then are swept away in rapid succession, if we turn from this, and look at life in its small details, as presented, say, in a comedy, how ridiculous it all seems. It is like a drop of water seen through a microscope, a single drop teeming with infusoria, or a speck of cheese full of mites invisible to the naked eye. How we laugh as they bustle about so eagerly and struggle with one another in so tiny a space. And whether here, or in the little span of human life, this terrible activity produces a comic effect. It is only in the microscope that our life looks so big. It is an indivisible point, drawn out and magnified by the powerful lenses of time and space. End chapter 2. This recording is in the public domain.
You cats, man.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
How do you get that?
Studies in Pessimism by Arthur Schopenhauer.
Big kitty.
Chapter 3.
I just want to be alone
On Suicide.
now.
As far as I know, none but the votaries of monotheistic, that is to say, Jewish religions, look upon suicide as a crime. This is all the more striking, inasmuch as neither in the Old nor in the New Testament is there to be found any prohibition or positive disapproval of it. So that religious teachers are forced to base their condemnation of suicide on philosophical grounds of their own invention. These are so very bad that writers of this kind endeavor to make up for the weakness of their arguments by the strong terms in which they express their abhorrence of the practice. In other words, they declaim against it. They tell us that suicide is the greatest piece of cowardice, that only a madman could be guilty of it, and other insipidities of the same kind. Or else they make the nonsensical remark that suicide is wrong, when it is quite obvious that there is nothing in the world to which every man has a more unassailable title than to his own life and person. Suicide, as I have said, is actually accounted a crime, and a crime which, especially under the vulgar bigotry that prevails in England, is followed by an ignominious burial and the seizure of the man's property. And for that reason, in a case of suicide, the jury almost always brings in a verdict of insanity. Now, let the reader's own moral feelings decide as to whether or not suicide is a criminal act. Think of the impression that would be made upon you by the news that someone you know had committed the crime, say, of murder or theft, or been guilty of some act of cruelty or deception. And compare it with your feelings when you hear that he has met a voluntary death. While in the one case a lively sense of indignation and extreme resentment will be aroused, and you will call loudly for punishment or revenge, in the other, you will be moved to grief and sympathy, and mingled with your thoughts will be admiration for his courage, rather than the moral disapproval which falls upon a wicked action. Who has not had acquaintances, friends, relations, who of their own will have left this world? And are these to be thought of with horror as criminals? Most emphatically, no. I am rather of opinion that the clergy should be challenged to explain what right they have to go into the pulpit, or take up their pens and stamp as a crime an action which many men whom we hold in affection and honor have committed, and to refuse an honorable burial to those who relinquish this world voluntarily. They have no biblical authority to boast of as justifying their condemnation of suicide. Nay, not even any philosophical arguments that will hold water. And it must be understood that it is arguments we want, and that we will not be put off with mere phrases or words of abuse. If the criminal law forbids suicide, that is not an argument valid in the Church, and besides, the prohibition is ridiculous. For what penalty can frighten a man who is not afraid of death itself? If the law punishes people for trying to commit suicide, it is punishing the want of skill that makes the attempt a failure. The ancients, moreover, were very far from regarding the matter in that light. Pliny says, "Life is not so desirable a thing as to be protracted at any cost. Whoever you are sure to die, even though your life has been full of abomination and crime. The chief of all remedies for a troubled mind is the feeling that among the blessings which nature gives to man, there is none greater than an opportune death, and the best of it is that everyone can avail himself of it." And elsewhere, the same writer declares, "Not even to God are all things possible, for he could not compass his own death if he willed to die." And yet, in all the miseries of our earthly life, this is the best of his gifts to man. Nay, in Massilia and on the island of Ceos, the man who could give valid reasons for relinquishing his life was handed the cup of hemlock by the magistrate, and that, too, in public. And in ancient times, how many heroes and wise men died a voluntary death? Aristotle, it is true,
He scared me.
declared suicide to be an offense against the state, although not against the person. But in Stobaeus' exposition of the peripatetic philosophy there is the following remark: "The good man should flee life when his misfortunes become too great. The bad man, also, when he is too prosperous." And similarly, "So he will marry and beget children, and take part in the affairs of the state, and generally practice virtue and continue to live. And then, again, if need be, and at any time necessity compels him, he will depart to his place of refuge in the tomb." And we find that the Stoics actually praised suicide as a noble and heroic action, as hundreds of passages show. Above all, in the works of Seneca, who expresses the strongest approval of it. As is well known, the Hindus look upon suicide as a religious act, especially when it takes the form of self-immolation by widows, but also when it consists in casting oneself under the wheels of the chariot of the god at Juggernaut, or being eaten by crocodiles in the Ganges, or being drowned in the holy tanks in the temples, and so on. The same thing occurs on the stage, that mirror of life. For example, in L'Orphelin de la Chine, a celebrated Chinese play, almost all the noble characters end by suicide, without the slightest hint anywhere, or any impression being produced on the spectator, that they are committing a crime. And in our own theatre is much the same. Palmyra, for instance, in Mahomet, or Mortimer, in Maria Stuart. Othello, Countess Terzky. Is Hamlet's monologue the meditation of a criminal? He merely declares that if we had any certainty of being annihilated by it, death would be infinitely preferable to the world as it is. But there lies the rub. The reasons advanced against suicide by the clergy of monotheistic, that is to say, Jewish religions, and by those philosophers who adapt themselves thereto, are weak sophisms, which can easily be refuted. The most thoroughgoing refutation of them is given by Hume in his essay on suicide. This did not appear until after his death, when it was immediately suppressed, owing to the scandalous bigotry and outrageous ecclesiastical tyranny that prevailed in England. And hence, only a very few copies of it were sold under cover of secrecy and at a high price. This and another treatise by that great man have come to us from Basel, and we may be thankful for the reprint. It is a great disgrace to the English nation that a purely philosophical treatise, which, proceeding from one of the first thinkers and writers in England, aimed at refuting the current arguments against suicide by the light of cold reason, should be forced to sneak about in that country, as though it were some rascally production, until at last it found refuge on the continent. At the same time, it shows what a good conscience the Church has in such matters. In my chief work, I have explained the only valid reason existing against suicide on the score of morality. It is this: that suicide thwarts the attainment of the highest moral aim by the fact that, for a real release from this world of misery, it substitutes one that is merely apparent. But from a mistake to a crime is a far cry, and it is as a crime that the clergy of Christendom wish us to regard suicide. Translator's note. Schopenhauer refers to Die Welt als Wille und Vorstellung, Volume 1, Section 69, where the reader may find the same argument stated at somewhat greater length. According to Schopenhauer, moral freedom, the highest ethical aim, is to be obtained only by a denial of the will to live. Far from being a denial, suicide is an emphatic assertion of this will, for it is in fleeing from the pleasures, not the sufferings of life, that this denial consists. When a man destroys his existence as an individual, he is not by any means destroying his will to live. On the contrary, he would like to live if he could do so with satisfaction to himself, if he could assert his will against the power of circumstance. But circumstance is too strong for him. End footnote. The inmost kernel of Christianity is the truth that suffering, the cross, is the real end and object of life. Hence, Christianity condemns suicide as thwarting this end, whilst in the ancient world, taking a lower point of view, held it in approval, nay, in honor. But if that is to be accounted a valid reason against suicide, it involves the recognition of asceticism. That is to say, it is valid only from a much higher ethical standpoint than has ever been adopted by moral philosophers in Europe. If we abandon that high standpoint, there is no tenable reason left, on the score of morality, for condemning suicide. The extraordinary energy and zeal with which the clergy of monotheistic religions attack suicide is not supported either by any passages in the Bible or by any considerations of weight, so that it looks as though they must have some secret reason for their contention. May it not be this, that the voluntary surrender of life is a bad compliment for him who said that all things were very good? If this is so, it offers another instance of the crass optimism of these religions, denouncing suicide to escape being denounced by it. It will generally be found that as soon as the terrors of life reach the point at which they outweigh the terrors of death, a man will put an end to his life. But the terrors of death offer considerable resistance. They stand like a sentinel at the gate leading out of this world. Perhaps there is no man alive who would not have already put an end to his life, if this end had been of a purely negative character, a sudden stoppage of existence. There is something positive about it. It is the destruction of the body, and a man shrinks from that because his body is the manifestation of the will to live. However, the struggle with that sentinel is, as a rule, not so hard as it may seem from a long way off, mainly in consequence of the antagonism between the ills of the body and the ills of the mind. If we are in great bodily pain, or the pain lasts a long time, we become indifferent to other troubles. All we think about is to get well. In the same way, great mental suffering makes us insensible to bodily pain. We despise it. Nay, if it should outweigh the other, it distracts our thoughts, and we welcome it as a pause in mental suffering. It is this feeling that makes suicide easy, for the bodily pain that accompanies it loses all significance in the eyes of one who is tortured by an excess of mental suffering. This is especially evident in the case of those who are driven to suicide by some purely morbid and exaggerated ill humor. No special effort to overcome their feelings is necessary, nor do such people require to be worked up in order to take the step. But as soon as the keeper, into whose charge they are given, leaves them for a couple of minutes, they quickly bring their life to an end. When, in some dreadful and ghastly dream, we reach the moment of greatest horror, it awakes us, thereby banishing all the hideous shapes that were born of the night. And life is a dream. When the moment of greatest horror compels us to break it off, the same thing happens. Suicide may also be regarded as an experiment, a question which man puts to nature.
I was just experimenting, bro.
The question is this: what change will death produce in a man's existence,
I'm supposed to get
and in his
whatever
insight
fine with me.
into the nature of things.
Ты кто? С Ромео?
It is a clumsy
тут.
experiment to
Молодец.
make,
Теперь
Oh,
выключи
for it
свой
involves
вывод
the
и
destruction of
Всё
the very
чисто, новый
ваш
consciousness
новый спецназ. Его
that puts
Я
the
так и не
question
выяснил, кто из них
and
первый.
awaits the answer.
конечно, помог.
Андриан Евгений...
Фил, это уже не вопрос.
Кто?
Бывай, Фил.
And
Тебе еще рано понимать.
Chapter
Я
3.
отмечу тебе точки, на которых, по моему мнению, они могли бы
This
остановиться.
recording is in the
Постарайся
public
избежать
domain.
контакта с ними. Никакой пальбы. За главного у них палач, бывший наемник, между прочим. В портки не гадить, лица не терять. Палач из любителей пошутить. Сам поострить любит, чужие хох... Да, все так.
Okay.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Studies in
Suck with
Pessimism
audiobooks?
by Arthur Schopenhauer.
I do.
Chapter 4. Immortality, a Dialogue. Translator's Note. The word immortality, Unsterblichkeit, does not occur in the original, nor would it, in its usual application, find a place in Schopenhauer's vocabulary. The word he uses is Unzerstörbarkeit, but I prefer immortality, because that word is commonly associated with the subject touched upon in this little debate. If any critic doubts the wisdom of this preference, let me ask him to try his hand at a short, concise, and at the same time popularly intelligible rendering of the German original, which runs thus. Zur Lehre von der Unzerstörbarkeit unseres
Oh my
wahren
God, bro.
Wesens durch den Tod.
I'm not
Meine
doing...
dialogische Schlussbelustung.
I'm not learning this language. Get it out my face.
End footnote.
End footnote.
Dramatis Personae, Thrasymachus, and Philalethes. Thrasymachus.
Yep.
Tell me now, in one word, what shall I be after my death? And mind you, be clear and precise. Philalethes. All and nothing. Thrasymachus. I thought so. I gave you a problem and you solve it by a contradiction. That's a very stale trick. Philalethes. Yes, but you raise transcendental questions, and you expect me to answer them in language that is only made for immanent knowledge. It's no wonder that a contradiction ensues. Thrasymachus. What do you mean by transcendental questions and immanent knowledge? I've heard these expressions before, of course. They're not new to me. The professor was fond of using them, but only as predicates of the deity, and he never talked of anything else, which was all quite right and proper. He argued thus. If the deity was in the world itself, he was immanent. If he was somewhere outside it, he was transcendent. Nothing could be clearer and more obvious. You knew where you were. But this Kantian rigmarole won't do anymore. It's antiquated and no longer applicable to modern ideas. Why, we've had a whole row of eminent men in the metropolis of German learning. Philalethes. German humbug, he means. Thrasymachus. The mighty Schleiermacher, for instance, and that gigantic intellect Hegel. And at this time of day we've abandoned that nonsense. I should rather say, we're so far beyond it that we can't put up with it anymore. What's the use of it then? What does it all mean? Philalethes. Transcendental knowledge is knowledge which passes beyond the bounds of possible experience, and strives to determine the nature of things as they are in themselves. Immanent knowledge, on the other hand, is knowledge which confines itself entirely with those bounds, so that it cannot apply to anything but actual phenomena. As far as you are an individual, death will be the end of you. But your individuality is not your true and inmost being. It is only the outward manifestation of it. It is not the thing in itself, but only the phenomenon presented in the form of time, and therefore with a beginning and an end. But your real being knows neither time nor beginning nor end, nor yet the limits of any given individual. It is everywhere present in every individual, and no individual can exist apart from it. So when death comes, on the one hand, you are annihilated as an individual. On the other, you are and remain everything. That is what I meant when I said that after your death, you would be all and nothing. It is difficult to find a more precise answer to your question, and at the same time be brief. The answer is contradictory, I admit, but it is so simply because your life is in time, and the immortal part of you in eternity. You may put the matter thus. Your immortal part is something that does not last in time and yet is indestructible. But there you have another contradiction. You see what happens by trying to bring the transcendental within the limits of immanent knowledge? It is in some sort doing violence to the latter by misusing it for ends it was never meant to serve. Thrasymachus. Look here. I shan't give 2 pence for your immortality unless I'm to remain an individual. Philalethes. Well, perhaps I may be able to satisfy you on this point. Suppose I guarantee that after death you shall remain an individual, but only on condition that you first spend 3 months of complete unconsciousness. Thrasymachus. I shall have no objection to that. Philalethes. But remember, if people are completely unconscious, they take no account of time. So when you are dead, it's all the same to you whether 3 months pass in the world of consciousness, or 10,000 years. In the one case as in the other, it is simply a matter of believing what is told you when you awake. So far then, you can afford to be indifferent whether it is 3 months or 10,000 years that pass before you recover your individuality. Thrasymachus. Yes, if it comes to that, I suppose you're right. Philalethes. And if, by chance, after those 10,000 years have gone by, no one ever thinks of awakening you, I fancy it would be no great misfortune. You would have become quite accustomed to non-existence after so long a spell of it, following upon such a very few years of life. At any rate, you may be sure you would be perfectly ignorant of the whole thing. Further, if you knew that the mysterious power which keeps you in your present state of life had never once ceased in those 10,000 years to bring forth other phenomena like yourself, and to endow them with life, it would fully console you. Thrasymachus. Indeed. So you think you're quietly going to do me out of my individuality with all this fine talk? But I'm up to your tricks. I tell you, I won't exist unless I can have my individuality. I'm not going to be put off with mysterious powers and what you call phenomena. I can't do without my individuality, and I won't give it up. Philalethes. You mean, I suppose, that your individuality is such a delightful thing, so splendid, so perfect, and beyond compare, that you can't imagine anything better? Aren't you ready to exchange your present state for one which, if we can judge by what is told us, may possibly be superior and more endurable? Thrasymachus. Don't you see that my individuality, be it what it may, is my very self? To me it is the most important thing in the world. For God is God, and I am I. I want to exist. I. That's the main thing. I don't care about an existence which has to be proved to be mine before I can believe it. Philalethes. Think what you're doing when you say, I want to exist. It is not you alone that says this. Everything says it. Absolutely everything that has the faintest trace of consciousness. It follows, then, that this desire of yours is just the part of you that is not individual, the part that is common to all things without distinction. It is the cry, not of the individual, but of existence itself.
О, ты вернулся. Как
It is the
прогулка?
intrinsic
Понятно?
element in
Так, а теперь
everything that
предлагаю
exists.
обстоятельства.
Nay, it is the
Где, кого,
cause of
когда и
anything
как.
existing at all.
Столового на скалолаза, блин, на него нет.
This
Чё-то
desire
не мутит
craves for,
характер.
and so is
Вырисовывается
satisfied
крайне
with,
неприятная
nothing
женщина.
less than
Мыльная
existence
Стаса,
in general.
кузница кадров.
Not
Когда
any
Зигфрид
definite
предал нас,
individual
переметнулся в
existence.
Ну ты не
No,
гони так,
that is not its
дверное
aim.
замечание. Еще не слыхал про
It
нашу
seems to be
местная
so,
легенда.
only
Лёхи
because
на
this
базе
desire,
Да,
this
да,
will,
дружуга. Пока я
attains
думаю о том, как
consciousнess
нам действовать
only
дальше,
in the
закончим с
individual,
Лёхой и заслужим
and therefore
уважение. В
looks
будущем
as
Лёха
though
его
it were
информация
concerned with
может
nothing
оказаться
but the
тебе очень
individual.
полезной.
There lies the illusion. An illusion, it is true, in which the individual is held fast, but, if he reflects, he can break the fetters and set himself free. It is only indirectly, I say, that the individual has this violent craving for existence. It is the will to live, which is the real and direct aspirant, alike and
Куда
identical in
несет
all things.
слава, как похмелье.
Since
Ты
then,
о ней не просишь,
existence
а
is
все
the
равно
free
тебя
work,
находит.
nay,
И
the
потом
mere
гремит
reflection of the
так,
will,
что
for existence
говори,
is,
без
there too,
шуток.
must be will.
Вот так и
And
есть.
for the moment,
Серьезней.
the will
Начисто.
finds its satisfaction
Первый
in
раз
existence
позволю тебе
itself,
сразиться
so
со
far, I
мной
mean,
за
as that which
бесплатно.
never
Если
rests but presses
проиграешь
forward
и вдруг
eternally can never
захочешь
find any
реванш,
satisfaction at all.
вздрогнем.
The will is careless of the individual. The individual is not its business, although, as I've said, this seems to be the case because the individual has no direct consciousness of will except in himself. The effect of this is to make the individual careful to maintain his own existence, and if this were not so, there would be no surety for the preservation of the species. From all this, it is clear that individuality is not a form of perfection, but rather of limitation, and so to be freed from it is not loss but gain. Trouble yourself no more about the matter. Once thoroughly recognize what you are, what your existence really is, namely, the universal will to live, and the whole question will seem to you childish and most ridiculous. Thrasymachus. You're childish yourself and most ridiculous, like all philosophers. And if a man of my age lets himself in for a quarter of an hour's talk with such
Что
fools,
пробрало?
it is only because it
По
amuses
новой
me and
давай.
passes the time. I've more important business to attend to, so goodbye. End chapter 4. This recording is in the public domain.
I'm drunk. Kidding. Do it. I want to redeem it.
This is a
You know,
LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain.
Gamble.
For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
.org.
Studies in Pessimism by Arthur Schopenhauer. Chapter 5.
Пахнет. Ну,
Psychological Observations.
что пробрало? По новой давай.
There is an unconscious propriety in the way in which, in all European languages, the word person is commonly used to denote a human being. The real meaning of persona is a mask, such as actors were accustomed to wear on the ancient stage.
Что пробрало?
And it is quite true that no one shows himself as he is, but wears his mask and plays his part.
Ну,
Indeed,
что
the whole of our
пробрало?
social arrangements may be
Новой
likened
давай.
to a perpetual comedy.
Как же мне хорошо.
And this is why a man who is
Ты
worth
как,
anything
в
finds
порядке?
society so insipid,
Ты крепкий
while a
малый.
blockhead is quite
Я
calm
думал,
in it.
You're
свалишь
driving
в
me
двух
crazy,
глоточков.
bro.
Едем
Reason
вперед.
deserves to be called a prophet, for in showing us the consequence and effect of our actions in the
Это
present,
было...
does it
Я
not tell us what the future will be? This is precisely why reason is such an excellent power of restraint in moments when we are possessed by some base passion, some fit of anger,
Уже
some
болтаешь,
covetous
будто как
desire
хорошо стараешься.
that will lead
Зайди к
us to
себе,
do
есть ли
things
командир коммунист?
whereof we must presently repent.
Damn, you got me walking all over
Hatred.
the place.
Comes from the heart, contempt from the head, and neither feeling is quite within our control. For we cannot alter our heart. Its basis is determined by motives,
Way.
and our head deals with objective
Чего тебе надо,
facts and
салага?
applies to them rules which are
Ромео
immutable.
из тебя своего протеже, типа,
Any given
работа-то
individual is the union of a particular heart with a particular head. Hatred and contempt are diametrically opposed and mutually exclusive. There are even not a few cases where hatred of a person is rooted in nothing but forced esteem for his qualities. And besides, if a man sets out to hate all the miserable creatures he meets, he will not have much energy left for anything else, whereas he can despise them, one and all, with the greatest ease. True, genuine contempt is just the reverse of true, genuine pride. It keeps quiet and gives no sign of its existence. For if a man shows that he despises you, He signifies at least this much regard for you, that he wants to let you know how little he appreciates you, and his wish is dictated by hatred, which cannot exist with real contempt. On the contrary, if it is genuine, it is simply the conviction that the object of it is a man of no value at all. Contempt is not incompatible with indulgent and kindly treatment, and for the sake of one's own peace and safety, this should not be omitted. It will prevent irritation, and there is no one who cannot do harm if he is roused to it. But if this pure, cold, sincere contempt ever shows itself, it will be met with the most truculent hatred, for the despised person is not in a position to fight contempt with its own weapons. Melancholy is a very different thing from bad humor, and of the two, it is not nearly so far removed from a gay and happy temperament. Melancholy attracts, while bad humor repels. Hypochondria is a species of torment which not only makes us unreasonably cross with the things of the present, not only fills us with groundless anxiety on the score of future misfortunes entirely of our own manufacture, but also leads to unmerited self-reproach for what we have done in the past. Hypochondria shows itself in a perpetual hunting after things that vex and annoy, and then brooding over them. The cause of it is an inward, morbid discontent, often coexisting with a naturally restless temperament. In their extreme form, this discontent and this unrest lead to suicide. Any incident, however trivial, that rouses disagreeable emotion leaves an after effect in our mind, which for the time it lasts, prevents our taking a clear, objective view of the things about us, and tinges all our thoughts, just as a small object held close to the eye limits and distorts our field of vision. What makes people hard-hearted is this, that each man has, or fancies he has, as much as he can bear in his own troubles. Hence, if a man suddenly finds himself in an unusually happy position, it will in most cases result in his being sympathetic and kind. But if he has never been in any other than a happy position, or this becomes his permanent state, the effect of it is often just the contrary. It so far removes him from suffering that he is incapable of feeling any more sympathy with it. So it is that the poor often show themselves more ready to help than the rich. At times, it seems as though we both wanted and did not want the same thing, and felt at once glad and sorry about it. For instance, if on some fixed date we are going to be put to a decisive test about anything in which it would be a great advantage to us to come off victorious, we shall be anxious for it to take place at once, and at the same time, we shall tremble at the thought of its approach. And if, in the meantime, we hear that, for once in a way, the date has been postponed, we shall experience a feeling both of pleasure and of annoyance when the news is disappointing, but nevertheless it affords us a momentary relief. It is just the same thing if we are expecting some important letter carrying a definite decision, and it fails to arrive. In such cases, there are really two different motives at work in us, the stronger but more distant of the two being the desire to stand the test and to have the decision given in our favor, and the weaker, which touches us more nearly, the wish to be left for the present in peace and quiet, and accordingly, in further enjoyment of the advantage which, at any rate, attaches to a state of hopeful uncertainty, compared with the possibility that the issue may be unfavorable. In my head, there is a permanent opposition party, and whenever I take any step or come to any decision, though I may have given the matter mature consideration, it afterwards attacks what I've done, without, however, being each time necessarily in the right. This is, I suppose, only a form of rectification on the part of the spirit of scrutiny, but it often reproaches me when I do not deserve it. The same thing, no doubt, happens to many others as well. For where is the man who can help thinking that, after all, it were better not to have done something that he did with great deliberation? Quid tam dextro pede concipus ut te conatus, non poeniteat votique paracti. Why is it that common is an expression of contempt, and that uncommon, extraordinary, distinguished, denote approbation? Why is everything that is common contemptible? Common, in its original meaning, denotes that which is peculiar to all men, i.e., shared equally by the whole species, and therefore an inherent part of its nature. Accordingly, if an individual possesses no qualities beyond those which attach to mankind in general, he is a common man. Ordinary is a much milder word, and refers rather to intellectual character, whereas common has more of a moral application. What value can a creature have that is not a whit different from millions of its kind? Millions, do I say? Nay, an infiniture of creatures which, century after century, in never-ending flow, nature sends bubbling up from her inexhaustible springs, as generous with them as the smith,
God, leave me alone.
useless sparks that fly around his anvil. It is obviously quite right that a creature which has no qualities except those of the species should have to confine its claim to an existence entirely within the limits of the species, and live a life conditioned by those limits. In various passages of my works, I have argued that whilst a lower animal possesses nothing more than the generic character of its species, man is the only being which can lay claim to possess an individual character. But in most men, this individual character comes to very little in reality, and they may be almost all ranged under certain classes. Ce sont des espèces. Their thoughts and desires, like their faces, are those of the species, or, at any rate, those of the class to which they belong, and accordingly, they are of a trivial, everyday, common character, and exist by the thousand. You can usually tell beforehand what they are likely to do and say. They have no special stamp or mark to distinguish them. They are like manufactured goods, all of a piece. If, then, their nature is merged in that of the species, how shall their existence go beyond it? The curse of vulgarity puts men on a par with the lower animals by allowing them none but a generic nature, a generic form of existence. Anything that is high or great or noble must then, as a matter of course, and by its very nature, stand alone in a world where no better expression can be found to denote what is base and contemptible than that which I have mentioned as in general use, namely, common.
Fuck.
Will, as the thing in itself, is the foundation of all being. It is part and parcel of every creature, and the permanent element in everything. Will, then, is that which we possess in common with all men. Nay, with all animals, and even with lower forms of existence. And insofar we are akin to everything, so far that is, as everything is filled to overflowing with will. On the other hand, that which places one being over another and sets differences between man and man is intellect and knowledge. Therefore, in every manifestation of self we should, as far as possible, give play to the intellect alone, for as we have seen, the will is the common part of us. every violent exhibition of will is common and vulgar. In other words, it reduces us to the level of the species. It makes us a mere type and example of it, in that it is just the character of the species that we are showing. So every great fit of anger is something common. Every unrestrained display of joy or of hate or fear. In short, every form of emotion, in other words, every movement of the will, if it's so strong as decidedly to outweigh the intellectual element of consciousness, and to make the man appear as a being that wills rather than knows. In giving way to emotion of this violent kind, the greatest genius puts himself
I
on
love
a
how
level
a
with the
group of
commonest
enemies
son
just
of
spawn
earth.
behind me. That's so great.
Contrarily,
I love that. That's such
if a
great
man
game
desires to
design,
be
dude.
absolutely uncommon, in other words, great, he
This
should
is
never
the
allow
stupidest
his
shit ever.
consciousness to be taken possession of and dominated by the movement of his will, however much he may be solicited thereto. For example, he must be able to observe that other people are badly disposed towards him, without feeling any hatred towards them himself. Nay, there is no surer sign of a great mind than that it refuses to notice annoying and insulting expressions, but straightway ascribes them, as it ascribes countless other mistakes, to the defective knowledge of the speaker, and so merely observes without feeling them. This is the meaning of that remark of Gratian, that nothing is more unworthy of a man than to let it be seen that he is one. El mayor tesoro de un hombre es dar muestras de que es hombre. And even in the drama, which is the peculiar province of the passions and emotions, it is easy for them to appear common and vulgar. And this is especially observable in the works of the French tragic writers, who set no other aim before themselves but the delineation of the passions. And by indulging at one moment in a vaporous kind of pathos which makes them ridiculous, at another in epigrammatic witticisms, endeavor to conceal the vulgarity of their subject. I remember seeing the celebrated Mademoiselle Rachel as Maria Stuart, and when she burst out fury against Elizabeth, though she did it very well, I could not help thinking of a washerwoman. She played the final parting in such a way as to deprive it of all true tragic feeling, of which
Get some
indeed
fucking
the
heals
French have
out.
no notion at all.
God, these games are
The same
insane,
part
bro.
was incomparably better played by the Italian Ristori, and in fact the Italian nature, though in many respects very different from the German, shares its appreciation for what is deep, serious, and true in art, herein opposed to the French, which everywhere betrays that it possesses none of this feeling whatever. The noble, in other words, the uncommon element in the drama, nay, what is sublime in it,
Oh my
is
fucking
not reached
god,
until
dude.
the
Are you
intellect
kidding?
is set to
You
work,
kidding? What
as
are
it
you?
mostly
Just
will,
go.
until it takes a free flight over all those passionate movements of the will and makes them subject of its contemplation. Shakespeare, in particular,
Some
shows
random
that this
fucking
is his general
ghost
method,
mutant.
more especially in Hamlet. And only when intellect rises to the point where the vanity of all effort is manifest, and the will proceeds to an act of self-annulment, is the drama tragic in the true sense of the word. It is then that it reaches its highest aim in becoming really sublime. Every man takes the limits of his own field of vision for the limits of the world.
Hey, bro.
This is an error of the intellect, as inevitable as that error of the eye which lets us fancy
I like
that
how
on the
100 of
horizon
them just
heaven
spawned
and
on
earth
me
meet.
when there was nothing there.
This explains many things, and among them, the fact that everyone measures
You wanna
us
go up the fucking
with his
hill,
own
bro?
standard, generally about as long
Go!
as a table,
Go!
and we have to put up with it.
Stupid ass
also-
shit, man.
That no one will allow us to be taller than himself. A supposition which is once for all taken for granted. There is no doubt that many a man owes his good fortune in life solely to the circumstance that he has a pleasant way of smiling, and so wins the heart in his
What
favor.
is he even shooting at me?
However, the heart would do better to be careful, and remember what Hamlet put down in his tablets, that one may smile and smile
I'm so frustrated.
and be a villain.
Just what?
Everything that is really fundamental in a man, and therefore genuine, works as such, unconsciously. In this
Fuck
respect,
off, bro.
like the power of nature,
What is even hitting me?
that which is passed through the domain of consciousness is thereby transformed into an idea or picture. And so, if it comes to be uttered, it is only an idea or picture which passes from one person to another. Accordingly, any quality of mind or character that is genuine and lasting is originally unconscious, and it is only when unconsciously brought into play that it makes a profound impression.
Crash out imminent.
If any like quality is consciously exercised, it means that it has been worked up, it becomes intentional, and therefore
Raids,
matter of
bombs,
affectation, in other
instigative,
words,
shooting
of
through the
deception.
trees, and this is crazy.
If a man does a thing unconsciously, it costs him no trouble. But if he tries to do it by taking trouble, he fails.
Damn, bro. What cancer?
This applies to the origin of those fundamental ideas which form
off.
the pith and marrow of all genuine work. Only that which is innate
This
is
sucks,
genuine and will hold
bro.
water.
What
And
can
every
you
man who wants to achieve something, whether in practical life, in literature, or in art, must follow the rules without knowing them. Men of very great capacity will, as a rule, find the company of very stupid people preferable to that of the common run, for the same reason that the tyrant and the mob, the grandfather and the grandchildren, are natural allies. That line of Ovid's, Ponaque cum spectant animalia cetera terram, can be applied in its true physical sense to the lower animals alone, but in metaphorical and spiritual sense it is, alas, true of nearly all men as well. All their plans and projects are merged in the desire of physical enjoyment, physical well-being. They may, indeed, have personal interests, often embracing a very varied sphere, but still these latter receive their importance entirely from the relation in which they stand to the former. This is not only proved by their manner of life and the things they say, but it even shows itself in the way they look, the expression of their physiognomy, their gait and gesticulations. Everything about them cries out, in terram prona. It is not to them, it is only to the nobler and more highly endowed natures, men who really think and look about them in the world and form exceptional specimens of humanity, that the next lines are applicable. Os homine sublime dedit coelumque tueri, iusit et iratos, ad sidera tolere vultus. No one knows what capacities for doing and suffering he has in himself, until something comes to rouse them to activity, just as in a pond of still water, lying there like a mirror, there is no sign of the roar and thunder with which it can leap from the precipice, and yet remain what it is, or again, rise high in the air as a fountain. When water is as cold as ice, you can have no idea of the latent warmth contained in it. Why is it that, in spite of all the mirrors in the world, no one really knows what he looks like? A man may call to mind the face of his friend, but not his own. Here, then, is an initial difficulty in the way of applying the maxim, know thyself. This is partly, no doubt, to be explained by the fact that it is physically impossible for a man to see himself in the glass, except with face turned straight towards it and perfectly motionless. For the expression of the eye, which counts for so much, and really gives its whole character to the face, is to a great extent lost. But coexisting with this physical impossibility, there seems to me to be an ethical impossibility of an analogous nature and producing the same effect. A man cannot look upon his own reflection as though the person presented there were a stranger to him, and yet this is necessary if he is to take an objective view. In the last resort, an objective view means a deep-rooted feeling on the part of the individual as a moral being that that which he is contemplating is not himself. And unless he can take this point of view, he will not see things in a really true light, which is possible only if he is alive to their actual defects, exactly as they are. Instead of that, when a man sees himself in the glass, something out of his own egotistic nature whispers to him to take care to remember that it is no stranger but himself that he is looking at. And this operates as a noli me tangere, and prevents him from taking an objective view. It seems indeed as if, without the leaven of a grain of malice, such a view were impossible. According as a man's mental energy is exerted or relaxed, will life appear to him either so short and petty and fleeting that nothing can possibly matter over which it is worth his while to spend emotion, that nothing really matters, whether it is pleasure or riches or even fame, and that in whatever way a man may have failed, he cannot have lost much. Or, on the other hand, life will seem so long, so important, so all in all, so momentous, and so full of difficulty, that we have to plunge into it with our whole soul if we are to obtain a share of its goods, make sure of its prizes, and carry out our plans. This latter is the imminent and common view of life. It is what Gratian means when he speaks of the serious way of looking at things. Tomar muy de veras el viver. The former is the transcendental view, which is well expressed in Ovid's Onus Tanti. It is not worth so much trouble. Still better, however, by Plato's remark, that nothing in human affairs is worth any great anxiety. This condition of mind is due to the intellect having got the upper hand in the domain of consciousness, where, freed from the mere service of the will, it looks upon the phenomena of life objectively, and so cannot fail to gain a clear insight into its vain and futile character. But, in the other condition of mind, will predominates, and the intellect exists only to light it on its way to the attainment of its desires. A man is great or small, according as he leans to the one or to the other of these views of life. People of very brilliant ability think little of admitting their errors and weaknesses, or of letting others see them. They look upon them as something for which they have duly paid, and instead of fancying that these weaknesses are a disgrace to them, they consider that they are doing them an honor. This is especially the case when the errors are of the kind that hang together with their qualities, conditionis sine quibus non, or as George Sand said, les défauts de ses vertus. Contrarily, there are people of good character and irreproachable intellectual capacity who, far from admitting the few little weaknesses they have, conceal them with care, and show themselves very sensitive to any suggestion of their existence. And this, just because their whole merit consists in being free from error and infirmity. If these people are found to have done anything wrong, their reputation immediately suffers. With people of only moderate ability, modesty is mere honesty. But with those who possess great talent, it is hypocrisy. Hence, It is just as becoming in the latter to make no secret of the respect they bear themselves, and no disguise of the fact that they are conscious of unusual power, as it is in the former to be modest. Valerius Maximus gives some very neat examples of this in his chapter on self-confidence, De Fiducia Sui. Not to go to the theater is like making one's toilet without a mirror. But it is still worse to take a decision without consulting a friend. For a man may have the most excellent judgment in all other matters, and yet go wrong in those which concern himself, because here the will comes in, and deranges the intellect at once. Therefore, let a man take counsel of a friend. A doctor can cure everyone but himself. If he falls ill, he sends for a colleague. In all that we do, we wish, more or less, to come to the end. We are impatient to finish, and glad to be done. But the last scene of all, the general end, is something that, as a rule, we wish as far off as may be. Every parting gives a foretaste of death. Every coming together again, a foretaste of the resurrection. This is why even people who were indifferent to each other rejoice so much if they come together again after 20 or 30 years' separation. Intellects differ from one another in a very real and fundamental way, but no comparison can well be made by merely general observations. It is necessary to come close, to go into details. For the difference that exists cannot be seen from afar, and it is not easy to judge by outward appearances, as in the several cases of education, leisure, and occupation. But even judging by these alone, it must be admitted that many a man has a degree of existence at least 10 times as high as another. In other words, exists 10 times as much. I am not speaking here of savages whose life is often only 1 degree above that of the apes in their woods. Consider, for instance, Porter in Naples or Venice in the north of Europe. Solicitude for the winter months makes people more thoughtful and therefore reflective. Look at the life he leads, from its beginning to its end, driven by poverty, living on his physical strength, meeting the needs of every day, nay, of every hour, by hard work, great effort, constant tumult, want in all its forms. No care for the morrow, his only comfort rest after exhaustion, continuous quarreling, not a moment free for reflection. Such sensual delights as a mild climate and only just sufficient food will permit of. And then, finally, as the metaphysical element, the crass superstition of his church, the whole forming a matter of life with only a low degree of consciousness, where a man hustles, or rather is hustled, through his existence. This restless and confused dream forms the life of how many millions? Such men think only just so much as is necessary to carry out their will for the moment. They never reflect upon their life as a connected whole, let alone, then, upon existence in general. To a certain extent, they may be said to exist without really knowing it. The existence of the mobsman, or the slave who lives on in this unthinking way, stands very much nearer than ours to that of the brute, which is confined entirely to the present moment. But, for that very reason, it has also less of pain in it than ours. Nay, since all pleasure is in its nature negative, that is to say, consists in freedom from some form of misery or need, the constant and rapid interchange between setting about something and getting it done, which is the permanent accompaniment of the work they do,
Как дела, салага?
and then
Ну, не
again
сказал,
the
что Фрунзе
augmented
отозвался
form
тебе.
which
Бруто, ты,
this
похоже,
takes when
ничего
they go
страшного.
from work
Ты
to
хорошо
rest,
потрудился, но
and the
наперекор и сегодня.
satisfaction of
На
their
базе все
needs.
больше странного происходит.
All this gives them a constant source of enjoyment, and the fact that it is
There
much
we go.
commoner to see happy faces amongst the poor
Yep.
than amongst the rich is a sure proof that it is used to good advantage. Passing from this kind of man, consider next the sober, sensible merchant, who leads a life of speculation, thinks long over his plans and carries them out with great care, founds a house and provides for his wife, his children, and descendants. Takes his share, too, in the life of a community. It is obvious that a man like this has a much higher degree of consciousness than the former, and so his existence has a higher degree of reality. Then look at the man of learning, who investigates, it may be, the history of the past. He will have reached the point at which a man becomes conscious of existence as a whole, sees beyond the period of his own life, beyond his own personal
Oh,
interests,
I'm so
taking over
close,
the whole course of
boys.
the world's history. Then, finally, look at the poet or the philosopher, in whom reflection has reached such a height that instead of being drawn on to investigate any one particular phenomenon of existence, he stands in amazement before existence itself, this great sphinx, and makes it his problem. In him, consciousness has reached the degree of clearness at which it embraces the world itself. His intellect has completely abandoned its function as the servant of his will, and now holds the world before him, and the world calls upon him much more to examine and consider it than to play a part in it himself. If, then, the degree of consciousness is the degree of reality, such a man will be said to exist most of all, and there will be sense and significance in so describing him. Between the two extremes here sketched and the intervening stages, everyone will be able to find the place at which he himself stands. We know that man is in general superior to all other animals, and this is also the case in his capacity for being trained. Mohammedans are trained to pray with their faces turned towards Mecca 5 times a day, and they never fail to do it. Christians are trained to cross themselves on certain occasions, to bow, and so on. Indeed, it may be said that religion is the chef d'oeuvre of the art of training, because it trains people in the way they shall think. And, as is well known, you cannot begin the process too early. There is no absurdity so palpable but that it may be firmly planted in the human head if you only begin to inculcate it before the age of 5, by constantly repeating it with an air of great solemnity. For as in the case of animals, so in that of men,
Can I buy it
training is
with,
successful only when you begin in early youth. Noblemen and gentlemen are trained to hold nothing sacred but their word of honor, to maintain a zealous, rigid, and unshaken belief in the ridiculous code of chivalry, and if they are called upon to do so, to seal their belief by dying for it, and seriously to regard a king as a being of a higher order. Again, our expressions of politeness, the compliments we make, in particular the respectful attentions we pay to ladies, are a matter of training, as also our esteem for good birth, rank, titles, and so on. Of the same character is the resentment we feel at any insult directed against us, and the measure of this resentment may be exactly determined by the nature of the insult. An Englishman, for instance, thinks it a deadly insult to be told that he is no gentleman, or still worse, that he is a liar. A Frenchman has the same feeling if you call him a coward, and a German if you say he is stupid. There are many persons who are trained to be strictly honorable in regard to one particular matter, while they have little honor to boast of in anything else. Many a man, for instance, will not steal your money, but he will lay hands on everything of yours that he can enjoy without having to pay for it. A man of business will often deceive you without the slightest scruple, but he will absolutely refuse to commit a theft. Imagination is strong in a man when that particular function of the brain which enables him to observe is roused to activity without any necessary excitement of the senses.
Alright, that's cool.
Accordingly,
Nice little grind.
we find that imagination is active just in proportion as our senses are not excited by external objects. A long period of solitude, whether in prison or in a sick room, quiet, twilight, darkness,
Show me your moves.
these are the things that promote its activity, and under their influence it comes into play of itself. On the other hand, when a great deal of material is presented to our faculties of observation, as happens on a journey, or in the hurly-burly of the world, or again, in broad daylight, the imagination is idle, and even though call may be made upon it, refuses to become active, as though it understood that that was not its proper time. However, if the imagination is to yield any real product, it must have received a great deal of material from the external world. This is the only way in which its storehouse can be filled. The fantasy is nourished much in the same way as the body, which is least capable of any work and enjoys doing nothing just in the very moment when it receives its
I can't
food,
wait to get
which
to
it
this
has to
sniper
digest.
rifle.
And yet, it is to this very food that it owes the power which it afterwards puts forth at the right time. Opinion is like a pendulum, and obeys the same law. If it goes past the center of gravity on one side, it must go a like distance on the other, and it is only after a certain time that it finds the true point at which it can remain at rest. By a process of contradiction,
I like that.
distance
That's
and
badass.
space makes things look small, and therefore free from defect. This is why a landscape looks so much better in a contracting mirror or in a camera obscura than it is in reality. The same effect is produced by distance in time. The scenes and events of long ago and the persons who took part in them were a charming aspect to the eye of memory, which sees only the outlines and takes no note of disagreeable details. The present enjoys no such advantage, and so it always seems defective. And again, as regards space, small objects close to us look big, and if they are very close, we may be able to see nothing else. But when we go a little way off, they become minute and invisible. It is the same way again as regards time. The little incidents and accidents of every day fill us with emotion, anxiety, annoyance, passion, as long as they are close to us, when they appear so big, so important, so serious. But as soon as they are borne down the restless stream of time, they lose what significance they had. We think no more of them, and soon forget them altogether. They were big, only because they were near. Joy and sorrow are not ideas of the mind, but affectations of the will, and so they do not lie in the domain of memory. We cannot recall our joys and sorrows, by which I mean that we cannot renew them. We can recall only the ideas that accompanied them, and in particular, the things we were led to say, and these form a gauge of our feelings at the time.
Alright.
Hence, our memory of joys and sorrows is always imperfect, and they become.
Well, you have been listening to Arthur Schopenhauer. I am some fucking weird little femboy. I think that's enough grinding for right now. I'm gonna go take a break. Maybe try to find something to watch, something to eat. And if you're still watching,